When research involves humans, it is important that we take the necessary ethical and legal steps. This is to certify not only that data is collected, handled and processed in accordance to the legal and ethical obligations, but also that data can be shared where possible as a research output. At its basic level, there are requirements to ensure there is respect in collecting identifiable data, balancing the needs of the researcher and the participant, and minimizing harm. Now, the legal landscape across the EU is governed by the General Data Protection Regulation. Now, GDPR enables data subjects, and a subject being any personal data or information relating to an identified or identifiable person, to have greater control over their personal data. It requires that data controllers and processors provide clarity, transparency, and accountability to their data subjects on how and why their data is being processed. So taking these steps to comply, therefore, ensures there is integrity and trust in the research process between the data subjects and the findings produced. It is also worth saying at this point that GDPR only applies when there is personal data on living humans. So if data can be obtained anonymously or as personal data of the deceased, then it does not apply, but there is potentially other requirements and considerations to sharing that data that still needs to be considered. Now, when processing personal data, you need to do so on a legal basis, and this will depend on the data in question, so do check the guides and the further reading, as well as relevant support and research officers within your area for which legal basis to use. Now, GDPR also applies to any data controller and data processor in the EU. So if you are in the EU and collect personal data from data subjects from anywhere in the world, you need to adhere to GDPR. If you're outside of the EU and collect data on participants who live in the EU, then GDPR applies. But steps to take is really to find out what the national and international laws are and how they apply in your area. Only collect essential personal data. You may be required to complete a Data Protection Impact Assessment, a DPIA, and fundamentally to seek advice and consult further reading There are ethical responsibilities and overall respect to obtain informed consent for projects. Now, this can be a little confusing as consent is one of the tasks under which the data can be processed in GDPR terms, but still informed consent is required. So regardless of whether you're collecting data under GDPR consent terms or across the globe under different legal requirements, it's still best practice to collect informed consent when working with participants. And the consent should be valid, competent, informed and voluntary, and participants can freely withdraw or change consent during the process. Now, the practice does vary across the globe, so do consider your local requirements and best practice. But when obtaining consent, we need to provide participants with enough information to make an informed decision, usually through an information sheet. Now, this sheet needs to include all of the key information, including an overview of the project, how the data will be processed and stored, and who will have access to the data. And remember, there is a granular nature to data. So if we think back to the example of the interviews, the information sheet needs to cover the audio recordings, the transcription and the notes, as access and processing will be different for all three. For instance, if you use a transcription service to process the audio, we need to be transparent with the participants that this is going to occur. Consent can be written or verbal, and if it is verbal, it's usually recorded, but it does need to be documented. Also, if the research collects recognizable faces or voices, then explicit permission is required for onward sharing and future reuse, for example with images or audio recordings. And do consider the future reuse of data to allow data sharing, as usually you'll gain consent at the start of the project, so having this agreed at this point makes for a more effective project across the board. You can retrospectively go back and obtain informed consent after the data collection process, but it's a lot more time consuming and challenging, so best to get it at the start of the project, and that has you set up for the full It's worth pausing here just to think about the CARE principles, which is a new initiative that's come out of the Research Data Alliance in 2019. It fits quite nicely within the legal and ethical considerations section, but also links very closely to the sharing aspect around the FAIR principles we'll introduce later. Now, the CARE principle really takes up on board and integrates with the FAIR principles, and those have been the kind of current movement towards open data and open science that perhaps doesn't fully engage with Indigenous people's rights and interests. Now, the drive around open data, around those FAIR principles, where data becomes findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable, primary focus is on that the data will be obtained and then shared. But this does have a conflict when working in an international context and with Indigenous populations. And because there's this drive to increase data sharing, we need to consider that this does potentially create a tension for Indigenous people who have a right to assert greater control of the application and use of Indigenous data for Indigenous knowledge for the collective benefit of all. So within the CARE principles, we need to consider potentially the definition of cultural metadata during the collection of the data, the appropriate governance of that data during the project, the Indigenous ethics in terms of actually how that data is obtained, in addition to those FAIR principles of making it fair, accessible, but also the transparency and access equality to that data. And there's a whole host of resources for additional reading on this space, and it's worth taking the time to familiarise yourself with the CARE principles, how they link with the FAIR principles, and how to undertake research when you're working very closely with Indigenous populations.